Thank you, Tamsin. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it. I'll just get started and we'll just go through kind of the summary of the book, and then I'm happy to take questions after at the end. So this is a beautiful cover that Common Ground Press was able to come up with. So I'm really happy with the way it turned out. So this is a story of stories about food. It focuses on women's leadership in alternative food networks, which are usually called AFNs, in two areas of Oceania, Hawaii and Aotearoa, New Zealand, to generate food system change. The point is to show how activism around food issues can constitute tangible political achievements and foster a potential political awakening through shared relational experiences and knowledges. In order to support Indigenous women and all the women doing this important work, this book explores stories of successes, challenges, opportunities, difficulties, and joy. I share this work as a white, privileged academic woman in Hawaii, a settler colonial space, trying to navigate what it means to be an ally and to constantly renegotiate relationships to support justice and struggles for marginalized people everywhere. Recognizing my privilege. Someone singing. um, Recognizing my privilege, it's my responsibility to use it toward a beneficial purpose and to amplify the voices of women doing the important work of changing their respective food systems. Before I jump into the chapters, I need to talk briefly about language, because this came up consistently both in my research and writing. You'll see in the book that I italicize Hawaiian and Maori terms on first mention, and then I drop the italics. This was a deliberate choice. Some Hawaiian scholars argue we shouldn't italicize Olelo Hawaii at all, that it makes the native tongue appear foreign in its own land. I deeply respect that position. But as a non-Indigenous scholar in a settler colonial space, it felt like appropriation for me to adopt that convention. So I compromised. Italics on the first mention to signal, hey, this is important, learn this word, then treating it as normalized after. I also include a glossary that puts Indigenous terms, food systems jargon, and theoretical concepts all on equal footing, because they are equal. Traditional ecological knowledge is just as valid as Western scientific terminology. More valid, actually, when you consider that Indigenous agricultural systems fed millions of people sustainably for centuries, and our industrial system is destroying the planet in only decades. I also included a list of interviewees at the end, and in the text of the book, I treated them the same as academic sources, last name, comma, and the year of the interview, to identify that they are important knowledge holders and that their knowledge is just as valuable as academic knowledge. The theoretical framework here is intersectional feminist political ecology, which is a mouthful, I know. Basically, it means looking at how gender, race, class, and indigeneity intersect with environmental issues and power structures. But here's where I push it further. I add ecosystems themselves as actors in this analysis. The land isn't just a backdrop, it's family, it's an ancestor, it's an active participant in these food systems, and it helps us understand the difference between food security and food sovereignty. They are distinct concepts in the realm of food systems, each addressing different aspects of food access and control. Food security ensures that everyone has consistent access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. It focuses on large-scale food production, market stability, and industrial agriculture to provide food, especially in times of crisis. Food sovereignty empowers local communities to define their own food systems. It prioritizes sustainability, small-scale farming, and cultural relevance, challenging corporate-driven food systems to create a more just and environmentally conscious world. So at the core, food security is access to food, and food sovereignty is control over food systems. Throughout the book, I also refer to strategic essentialism as praxis. I am borrowing the term from Gayatri Spivak's concept here, in that women leaders in food system transformation are pragmatic. They're aiming to build power by temporarily claiming a stable identity to fight for food system change. This creates solidarity around food system issues among diverse individuals for this one common goal within the Hawaii and Aotearoa settler colonial contexts. I look at several key questions. How does women's leadership in these sites of resistance work in opposition to the settler colonial context? How do Indigenous and marginalized women and their allies shape that resistance? How do Indigenous understandings of ecosystems and Indigenous agricultural and food system practices, both ancient and modern, influence these forms of resistance? How does this resistance challenge the dominant industrialized agro-food system? A rich literature on alternative food networks exists, but little of it addresses women's roles from intersectional perspectives or in settler colonial settings. In fact, much of it comes from a deficit perspective, which replicates colonial understandings of Indigenous communities. Rather than focusing on deficits, we should be asking, what are a community's capacities, assets, available tools to improve food systems? We should focus on what we have and how we can make the best use of those assets to serve our communities. This book is based on interviews with women identifying farmers, food system professionals, public health advocates, nutritionists, lawyers, lobbyists, food bank and farmer cooperative managers, community organizers working on agricultural and food justice issues, educators, farmers union leaders, food waste diversion experts, teachers and garden educators, self-described compost nerds, as well as farmers market organizers and vendors. Why interview women specifically, though? Aren't there plenty of men doing this work too? The time required for AFN or alternative food network food provisioning and cooking, let alone growing food, increases the amount of care work women do for their families and can contribute to a triple burden on top of working outside the home and caring for families. But in all the years I've been working with different food system focused community partners as part of my teaching, I found that many of the leaders in this work are women, and I thought it would behoove us to listen to what they have to say, and it's my job to amplify their voices, making sure I speak with rather than speak for them. The book just highlights the ways in which the stories are connected and how we can learn from each other's lived experiences. I spent about a year doing research in Hawaii, and then 3 weeks in a camper van touring New Zealand's North Island, talking story with incredible women doing food system transformation work. And when I say talking story, I mean it. This isn't your typical interview-based formal research. We sat on farms and cafeterias, at farmers markets, coffee shops, sometimes in cars when it was raining. People shared food with me, sent me home with produce, corrected my Hawaiian and Maori pronunciation. It was messy and beautiful and exactly what the research needed to be. I spoke with 29 women in Hawaii, 19 in Aotearoa between 2019 and 2020, right before COVID shut the world down. In fact, I left Aotearoa just 5 days before they closed the borders, and I used Ma'awepono, a decolonizing methodology that expects researchers to do work for marginalized and Indigenous communities rather than claiming objectivity as the goal of research. It was developed in 2019 by Ku Kahakalau. Actually, it was developed much earlier, but she published it in 2019. And I intertwined that with intersectional feminist political ecology to highlight where marginal identities reside and intersect to uncover power dynamics and approaches to food sovereignty. Taking these two perspectives as a baseline, it's my job as a researcher to ensure that the research benefits the members of the communities who shared their stories with me, because those stories provide the gift of context for food system transformation. So chapter 1 addresses how colonization fundamentally broke these food systems. Both Hawaii and Aotearoa had sophisticated, sustainable agricultural systems that fed their populations with zero outside inputs for hundreds of years. Then colonizers showed up and said, we're going to improve this, and proceeded to, not do that at all. Here's what's fascinating, though. The colonial powers were different, so the destruction patterns were different, which means the resistance patterns are different too. In Hawaii, after the Mahele, or the land division in 1848, land was concentrated into massive plantations. You can see here the pineapple plantation. Sugar and pineapple were grown for export using imported labor. When that collapsed in the mid-1990s, the land just sort of sat there or got developed into housing. Now Hawaii imports 85 to 90% of its food. We have something like 5 to 10 days of food supply on island at any given time. That's terrifying. In Aotearoa, the Treaty of Waitangi was supposed to be about partnership, but the English version said something completely different than the Maori version that was signed. Classic colonizer move. Land got confiscated, but here where it gets interesting. The Waitangi Tribunal, established in 1975, has been hearing claims and making settlements. So some iwi, that's the word for Maori tribes, are getting land back, getting fishing rights back. It's not perfect, not even close, but it's a legal framework for Indigenous sovereignty that Hawaii just doesn't have. What really struck me in the interviews is that women in Aotearoa explicitly talk about colonization consistently. It's part of the daily discourse. In Hawaii, it's there, but it's more like a subtext. The colonization is so pervasive that people almost don't see it anymore. Both responses are forms of resistance, but they look really different. Chapter 2 is about the relationship between people and land, and this is where Indigenous worldviews really shine. In both Hawaiian and Maori cosmology, land isn't property, it's family. The Hawaiian word for aina literally means that which feeds, though often it's translated more simply into land. But that distinction is really important. The Maori word whenua means both land and placenta. That's not a metaphor, that's ontology. That's how the world actually is structured in these knowledge systems. So when we talk about malama aina, caring for the land, or kaitiakitanga, guardianship of the land, we're not talking about conservation in some abstract sense. We're talking about caring for your ancestor. You don't extract from your ancestor. You don't poison your ancestor. You reciprocate with your ancestor, and you make sure your children have the same resources available to them as your ancestors did. One of my favorite interviews was with Kate Walmsley, this amazing compost advocate in Wellington with a background in microbiology. She talked about how soil health, food security, mental health, water quality, and climate change are all connected. In the Western model, we tend to slice everything up into separate problems and then wonder why our solutions don't work. But she insisted that everything is an ecosystem, including us, so we should treat it that way and honor those connections. Several other women talked about nourishing the soil as nourishing the people, too. It's not a metaphor. Better soil grows more nutritious food, which creates healthier people, who then have the energy to care for that soil. It's circular, it's relational, it's the opposite of the extractive agro-industrial agricultural model that's currently destroying the planet. Chapter 3 looks at how education fits into food system transformation. And again, we see these different colonial contexts producing different solutions. In Hawaii, it's all about farm to school programs and school gardens, getting kids' hands in the dirt, teaching them where food comes from. And it sounds sort of simple, but the Hawaii Department of Education is, let's just say, recalcitrant. And that would be putting it mildly. There's this weird legacy issue where descendants of plantation workers who are now administrators and teachers in the Department of Education want nothing to do with agriculture because their parents and grandparents were exploited in the plantation fields. So they associate with farming with poverty and oppression, which fair, but it means there's this institutional resistance to agricultural education, even though it's one of the keys to food sovereignty. And the new models of sustainable and regenerative agriculture don't look anything like the large plantations of old, but that barrier is still there. Then you go to Aotearoa, and there's this incredible thing called Hua Parakore, which is an Indigenous organic certification system. But it's not just about checking boxes. It's a 40-week education program rooted in Maori values, and it's taught at marae, which are traditional Maori meeting grounds. So you're learning sustainable agriculture while simultaneously revitalizing your culture and language and connections to your iwi. One of the instructors told me that 90% of her students were women, and that men tend to start but not necessarily finish the course. And she thinks it's because women can see the bigger picture. They understand that this isn't just about growing food, it's about feeding their families, healing their communities, and resisting colonization all at once. Chapter 4 connects food sovereignty to public health, which should be obvious, but somehow isn't in most policy discussions. There's this incredible program at the Waianae Coast Comprehensive Health Center on the leeward coast of Oahu, where pediatricians literally write prescriptions for fresh fruits and vegetables that families can fill at the farmer's market that's located on the campus of the clinic. Think about that, treating food as medicine, which of course it is, instead of waiting until people are sick and then medicating them. But here's the kicker. Culturally appropriate food matters. It's not just about nutrition. It's about identity, about connection to ancestors, about resistance to the colonial imposition of certain foods. For example, after colonization, Native Hawaiians and Maori were forced to adopt Western diets, which led to massive health disparities. Diabetes, heart disease, obesity, these aren't just individual health issues, they're the result of food colonialism. Several women talk about decolonizing their diets, going back to traditional foods like kalo and ulu in Hawaii, or kumara and traditional seafood in Aotearoa. But it's not some romantic return to the past. It's about adapting traditional knowledge to contemporary contexts. It's political, it's personal, and it's absolutely necessary for community health because it results in an assets-based perspective of how we can address public health concerns instead of focusing on how sick people and communities are. And school lunch factors in as well here, since it's the one place that students with low socioeconomic status are sure to get a hot meal every day. But in Hawaii, most school cafeterias can only reheat food that's been cooked elsewhere. I interviewed this amazing woman named Auntie Tammy, who's fighting to bring scratch cooking back to schools using local ingredients and making culturally appropriate meals. She says women are built for this kind of care work. And while that risks essentialism, she also says, I don't care who does it as long as someone does it. And right now it's women, so here we are. And in Aotearoa, school lunch is not mandated by the state. So only certain schools provide it, and generally at a cost to families who may or may not be able to afford it. We must reframe food as a tool for health and sovereignty by understanding how nutrition, environment, and cultural identity intersect, the importance of policy, education, and community action in transforming food systems, and recognizing that decolonizing diets strengthens Indigenous food sovereignty, but also food sovereignty for everyone. One respondent said, what's good for Maoridom is good for everyone. And I think that applies here as well. For example, we can use school lunch programs as a site for change. They can be educational spaces for children to understand the importance of healthy local foods in their diets, examples of gendered attitudes toward cooking and its relationship to public, community, and family health, and spaces where the state, through its administration of programs, can promote food system transformation. Chapter 5 addresses meat, fish, and dairy production, and you can't do that without wading into debates about veganism and animal agriculture. But I found that Indigenous foodways generally include meat, traditionally, sustainably, and with a deep respect for the animals, but meat is part of the food system. I interviewed Jessica Rohr, who sells local meat in Hawaii, including venison from invasive axis deer that are literally destroying the ecosystem due to their large numbers and their lack of predators. They contribute to major erosion problems that not only affect the land, but the coral reef ecosystems as well. So eating that deer is environmental restoration. It's also nutritionally dense, it keeps money in the local economy, and it reduces dependence on imported factory farmed meat. But she faces criticism from vegan activists who see all meat consumption as ethically wrong, which completely ignores the Indigenous context and the reality of invasive species management. Then there's Ashley Watts, who runs a community-supported fishery, like it's called a CSF, like a CSA or community-supported agriculture, but for fish. She works with local fishers to create sustainable catch limits so they're incentivized to not overfish. She faced all kinds of sexism in this mostly male-dominated industry at the beginning, but she persisted, and she's been at it for about 5 years now. Oh, maybe 7 actually. I interviewed her and she'd only been at it for 2 years. So yeah. And now she's like the fish queen of Hawaii. Everybody sort of defers to her and her views on overfishing in terms of the industry. The dairy section was interesting too. I visited Kathy Tate Jameson's organic dairy farm in Aotearoa, and she talks about the cows as family, not in like a cutesy way, but in a literal genealogical way from her Maori worldview. The cows are happy, they're pasture raised, the milk quality is incredible, and the yogurt is delicious. Meanwhile, industrial dairy in Aotearoa is poisoning waterways and contributing massively to climate change. Same product, completely different relationship to land and animals. The last main chapter is about gifting and community engagement and how that translates to policy change. In both Hawaiian and Maori cultures, there's this tradition of the gifting economy. You grow in abundance, you share it with neighbors and family. It's not barter, it's not exchange. It's just, here's some food because I have it and you're part of my community. Several women talked about how they grow things specifically to give away, or how at the end of the farmer's market, instead of throwing away extra produce, they make sure it gets to people who need it. It sounds simple, but it's actually radical resistance to capitalism. It says, not everything is for profit. Some things are just about relationship and care. And then gifting knowledge. The women in this book are constantly connecting with each other, sharing grant opportunities, teaching each other techniques, amplifying each other's work. One woman said men are looking for recognition, but women just put their heads down and do the work, which echoes Auntie Tammy from a few chapters ago, which again risks essentializing. But it was said by a Maori woman reflecting on her own community, so I'm going to trust her read on it. The policy aspect is fascinating too because it shows how grassroots organizing can shift structural barriers. I interviewed Ashley Lukens, who organized this massive anti-GMO campaign in Hawaii. She went door to door, held intimate gatherings where women could ask questions without feeling stupid, and built this coalition that actually won buffer zones around schools to protect kids from pesticide drift. The chemical companies fought back hard, tried to discredit her personally, but the network of women activists protected her, and the anti-GMO legislation passed. The most successful organizations I found through this research held community listening tours to identify community needs and community assets. They embraced community-specific capacity building and structured food system resilience projects to be inclusive of local community inputs. They recognized the value of Indigenous agricultural systems and employed as many best practices from a combination of traditional ecological knowledge and sustainable agriculture. They also created and maintained connections among various food system actors. I'm not going to lie, there were also persistent challenges. Land use policy, based on Western conceptions of private property in a consumerist and accumulative capitalist system, is a barrier to Indigenous land management practices both in Hawaii and Aotearoa, and likely everywhere else throughout Oceania as well. Hawaii's lack of recognition of embedded colonization processes makes it difficult to critique the food system from a decolonizing perspective. Wholesale change in the definition of success is also necessary. We should instead focus on abundance of knowledge, of ancestral wisdom, and of Indigenous values to foster food sovereignty. Talking about decolonization makes people feel uncomfortable, but it may be easier to talk about food and use it as a lens through which to understand and resist our settler colonial systems because everyone's got to eat. And finally, this might be the most important point, we need to completely redefine success. In capitalist terms, most of these projects would be considered failures. They're not maximally profitable, they're labor intensive, they prioritize community over growth. But they're creating food sovereignty, they're healing land, they're revitalizing culture, they're building climate resilience. That's success. We just need economic and policy systems to keep up and recognize it as such. So, what do we take away from all this? First, these two contexts, Hawaii and Aotearoa, show us that there's no single path to food system transformation. Different colonial histories require different decolonizing strategies, but both are led by women, both center Indigenous knowledge, and both are creating alternative food networks that actually work for their communities. From the research, we can see that Hawaii's food system transformation hinges on nonprofit organization-led change. Some of these nonprofits interact with schools, hospitals, clinics, and other public and private institutions. Others are integrated into community and fostering change from the ground up through grassroots-led efforts and pushing the state for food system transformation, even though they're encountering resistance at every turn. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the treaty settlement framework enables communities and iwi to use a politico-legal framework to fight for either land back or reparations. They accomplish this through the inclusion of an explicitly colonial critique and have found success, though it's tenuous, in the halls of power. There's also a successful bottom-up grassroots approach that includes structural support. The Huaparakore Maori organic certification system available through the different marae is but one example. So if you look at the items I have in this list that I consider to be replicable models for other places looking to transform their food systems, like food co-ops, school garden networks, different certification and educational programs rooted in Indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge, and even food hub development, you might notice that they're all centered around regionalizing food systems. This means moving away from central growing and distribution centers with long supply chains that the pandemic showed us are not only unsustainable, but also dangerously fragile and not very resilient in the face of climate change or other world events. The questions remain, however, how do we scale these up to reach the most folks possible without losing the important community and local aspect of these projects? How can we fund these projects in the long term? How does the state, which for many marginalized communities, Indigenous or otherwise, has traditionally not been an ally, how does it implement policy change to foster this kind of food system transformation, both in the face of likely political opposition, but also climate adaptation goals? These are all questions that still need answering. Intersectionality matters, but not just as identity categories. It's about practice, about action, about solidarity across difference. The women in this book aren't just quote unquote women. They're mothers, farmers, educators, activists, Indigenous and settler, local and immigrant, and all those pieces inform their work. Soil health is human health, is community health, is climate health. You cannot separate these things. Any policy or project that tries to address them separately will end up failing. I'll end with this quote from the book. Stories are seeds. Some will grow and blossom into larger ideas and innovations, while others might not succeed or take hold. But as a whole, a garden teaches as much as it provides food, joy, and transformation. These women's stories are seeds. I'm hoping this book helps them germinate, helps people see what's possible when we center women's leadership, Indigenous knowledge, and community care in food system transformation. Because we're in a climate crisis, we're still living in settler colonial states, and the industrial food system is killing us. We need these alternatives, and we need them now. Okay, I'll stop talking and I will unshare my screen
Yeah,
and open it up for questions.
we'll open it up for questions. If you have a question, you can feel free to raise your hand or write your question in the chat. I might get things started with a question I have myself. I saw on your second last slide there that you mentioned policy changes. What do you think, as an expert that I'm not, would be sort of the most important policy change that could happen in terms of decolonializing food systems in relation to your book and research?
Yeah, thanks
It's
for
a
the
tricky
question.
one. Sorry,
Yeah,
so
yeah. I mean,
broad.
obviously, I don't have like the one answer, right? So I'll
Yeah.
just say that. um, but I think that this notion of re-regionalizing, finding ways to support, whether in terms of policy, right? That was the question. Finding ways maybe with tax incentives or with investment in food hubs, I think is a major, would be a major help in terms of policy. I think the notion that we import so much of our food here in Hawaii, and actually Aotearoa exports a ton of its food, and I mean they can feed themselves. They have the land, they have the resources, but a lot of their food is grown for export, especially the dairy industry, and it's just not sustainable. And so the idea is re-regionalizing so that local communities can feed themselves, and also, and this is less of a policy. But I think understanding seasonality and what that means in terms of is would be way more sustainable. Like we don't need to have strawberries or mangoes in December. It's just not necessary.
So then another question is between the two locations, population wise, are they very drastically different? The population of New Zealand is a lot less than the population of Hawaii, surely.
No, no. They
No.
I think they've got New Zealand's I think it's like 5 or 6 million people. We've only got 1.5 spread
Oh,
out
okay.
over 7 islands. But we do have 10 million tourists a year. So while and this is something that is at this point I don't have a solution for it. It seems insurmountable, but and I know that obviously Aotearoa, has obviously its tourism numbers as well, but if you look at the ancient Hawaiian systems, the Ahupua'a management systems, they were able to feed about 1 million people, a little less than 1 million people without any outside inputs, right? But they didn't have the 10 million tourists a year, right? So it's like, could we feed ourselves? Yeah, maybe, but we can't feed all the visitors, you know? And so there's that's an issue that I don't have an answer for. I don't think anybody does.
Yeah, something to work on in the future. So we've got one question in the chat that I'll just read out. It says, and Essa Mellon, you'll have to forgive me if I don't articulate it quite as you want to. The display of the risks of pesticides in your presentation necessitates a trend for organic food production. My question, have any feasible plans for such production that are smart ones? You know, is there any sort of feasible plans for organic food production? I think is the
Yeah, great
question.
question. I think, well, there's an interesting sort of dilemma, right? A lot of people think organic is like equates good, and it does. It's definitely better than conventional agriculture. There's no GMOs, there's less pesticides, etc. But there's industrial agriculture and industrial organic agriculture that's just this like really large scale kind of model of agriculture that is also problematic in terms of sustainability. So I think the argument is for sustainable agriculture, for regenerative agriculture, and for smaller scale agriculture, but in more places. But to do that, and that's actually part of your, one of the issues that does need to be addressed is we need more farmers. We need to pay farmers fairly. And it's really hard work. And we need to, educate farmers or educate more young people who might be interested in farming, who maybe don't want to work in an office, and this has not really been an option for a lot of kids because why? There's that barrier, that model of exploitative agriculture is sort of entrenched in people's minds. And so I think the argument is for organic, small scale agriculture in more places rather than just treating organic as one thing because it's not. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, there's another question here in the chat. Sorry. Were there any case studies or interview stories that you wanted to include but didn't include in your book?
Yeah, it wasn't a case study. It was just like one interview, and it was I did include her at the very last second, and because I realized, oh my God, I counted the interviewees and I only had 47, but I knew I had 48, and I was like, I missed someone. Oh my God, what have I done? And so then I went back through my notes and figured out who I had missed, and went back through my route, especially in Aotearoa, and I had missed a chef actually, and so and she it was really interesting. She was a chef at a cafe that was really focused on local food and trying to get local food into the restaurant. Oh, sorry, my dogs are trying to go outside. Um, and um, and she gave all the credit to her husband, who was not a chef. And I was like, wait, you know, it was her idea, and they did work together, but he was like front of house and she was back of house, and yeah, she just kind of like gave all the credits to the what she considered to be sort of the head of the household, which was interesting. So yeah, that's that's what happened.
We have another comment or question in the chat from Alexandra. So excited to be here. In brackets, I'm listening at a holiday luncheon.
Oh,
um,
that's
I would like to follow up with you because I'm a fellow anthropologist working on a new venture in Hawaii addressing food security and sovereignty. Oh, okay. Thanks, Alexandra. She's
cool.
put her email address in the chat there, so we can pass that along afterwards.
Yeah, that'd
Um,
be great. Oh, thanks,
uh,
Tracy. Yeah, I see that. Hmm.
let me see if there's any other questions that I can see here. Sorry, just looking at the chat. Did any of your findings surprise you or challenge your assumptions?
Absolutely. So great question. Thank you. So, in sort of the white Western feminist model that I've been, sort of steeped in throughout my education, I thought this sort of essentialist view of women's roles as mothers would be something that I would sort of tended to shy away from because I thought that, you take essentialism to its logical conclusion and there are no good outcomes, right? And so, but one of the interviewees, actually one in Hawaii and one in Aotearoa, sort of tuned me up on that, and she was like, mothering is, family care, is community care, is caring for the land, is caring for our ancestors. So that Indigenous worldview really sort of helped me take a step back and embrace that kind of those roles as a big part of these women's identities. And so then I sort of went back and was like, how do I theorize this? And that's when I ended up sort of finding Spivak's work with strategic essentialism and using that as praxis. As like, what are the actions that people take, within those contexts to try to change the food system.
We probably have time for another question if anyone wants to add something in here. Sorry. Oh, yes. Are there projects that you're currently working on that grow out or responding to seeds of change? Are you where to after this is
Oh, great
basic.
question. Thanks. So I will say, yeah, the pandemic threw me for a loop. I was supposed to also, part of the research project was I was supposed to go to French Polynesia, another colonized place with another colonizer, and ostensibly a different, response to, food system transformation. I was born and raised in France, so I speak French, and with my cobbled together Olelo Hawaii, I can sort of understand a few words here and there of Tahitian. And so I had a bunch of interviews set up and shut down, no in or out of Tahiti. So that is a possibility, sort of picking that back up. I wouldn't write another book about it. I'd probably publish an article about it if I were to do that. And then I'm also working on this project. It is related. It's still about food and sovereignty and decolonized diets. But there are, I live on the North Shore of Oahu, and near us, about 10, 12 miles down the road, there is a very heavy influence of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Mormon Church owns the entire town and owns a lot of land, and they have what are called welfare farms. And on those farms, it's basically like a community garden, but it's a bigger plot. It's a significant amount of land that every person gets. And so you can apply to be, if you have to be LDS, you can't just be any random, off the street. And you have to go to church and you have to grow the food to feed your community, your family and your community. But what's interesting is that the Polynesian Cultural Center is right nearby, and they sort of, give scholarships to university students to attend Brigham Young University, Hawaii, from all over the Pacific. So you've got Tongans, you've got Samoans, you've got, people from Vanuatu, Fijians, and they're all working at the Polynesian Cultural Center, but attending school and with these scholarships. And that's been decades. And so you've got the descendants of these people and some of these people who are growing their traditional foods on these welfare farms. Maybe they don't work at PCC anymore, but they're still members of the church. And they're growing these incredible varieties of ulu, these incredible varieties of kalo, and so basically, like, in in the face of a colonizing force like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in and of itself, it's not even a state, it's a church, it's a religion. They're sort of resisting the Western food and Western diets and growing their own traditional foods. It's really interesting. So I was thinking about doing some research on that. We started doing some interviews with a colleague who's a horticulture professor, and then we got busy. So I'm hoping to pick that back up.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I don't think we have any more questions in the chat, but I would like to thank Monique for your time today. Is there anything that you wanted to add on at the end here that we might have missed not
No, I,
discussed?
I don't think so. I just want to thank you for giving me the opportunity. And it's been a journey and a half. The book's publication was a long time coming, but I really appreciate the time and effort everybody put into it on your end. And it was a lot of work on everybody's part, I think. But thank you so much for the opportunity, not only to publish the book and but also to, get to sort of say my piece here. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And the link for the book is in the chat for those who want to click there, and read the abstract a little bit more and things like that. But thank you all for your time today. Have a
Thank you
great
for coming, everyone.
morning,
Yeah,
afternoon,
morning,
evening, wherever
afternoon.
you
I know.
are.
I noticed somebody was in the evening. So yeah, that's
Yeah,
fine.
yeah.
It's just getting light out here. So yeah.
Okay. Ready to start the day and already
Ready to
been
start this hot
productive.
coffee. Yes.
Have a good day. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Bye.